For motivation and other psychological aspects to be probed, there are statistical methods, say like correlations, etc. One can use. Descriptive methods are like interview and introspections. We have studied said this. And experimental method, clinical case study, survey, developmental and observation. Observation we have studied, survey we have studied. Clinical case is a very technical this thing, so we have not got into that. Interview methods we have studied. Correlation is a statistical tool, that statistical format, which once you use, you are able to correlate the relation between the two factor, and therefore you can decide whether one is happening due to the correlation of with the others. Is there a relation in one incidence happening with the other factor or an attribute? So there are many other aspects that needs to be come into picture for conducting a motivational research. So therefore it's a very complex a method of a psychology research, and therefore used only when it is most needed. When you are investing in a product which is of a significant importance to you, then yes, probably you go ahead and do that. So we will study select aspect from this, from the psychological research perspective. Not that everything will be covered, such as like, so for example, correlation, the statistical technique, we are not going to cover it essentially. So there are descriptive methods which we have discussed, as you say out here, descriptive methods. So that is interview and introspection. Introspection again have a three subset: causal, experimental and teacher. So now we are not going to get into each one of them in detail. We'll get a macro view. So in introspection method, so here interview, because we have covered earlier different types of in-depth interview, etc. So we have done that. So I am going to straight away get into introspection. Findings of introspection can lead to further research. So here introspection is like a prior understanding, prior findings, etc. as you say. So it may be just a starting point for another further fresh research to initiate. Only source of knowledge of sensation, feelings and motives, and so it can be used where a scientific method is not possible. So this is used, introspection is used where scientific way, that is there are no statistical tool related research method is possible, and then you get into doing the introspection way of research. When there is a general agreement on the reports, we may rely on its result. The various stakeholder has to rely on it because it may not have been done with a very scientific approach to the research problem. However, certain introspection approaches gives you the relevant signals, and now if that signal is acceptable to the stakeholders, you consider it as acceptable. Okay, disadvantage of such introspection method is the person may make his own spontaneous judgment. People, when there is no scientific background this thing to the findings, people may tend to get into making own judgments based on what has been presented to them. Subjective in nature, it cannot be checked whether it is a true or false, because it may vary from person to person, situation to situation, may differ from person to person. That's what I just told you. Having the same or a different experience may look at this introspection method related findings differently. So that's a disadvantage. May give contradictory results. What is true for one may not be true for the others. So as I told you, it depends on how you evaluate various stimulus. Here the source of knowledge of sensation, feelings, etc. They may differ person to person based on his background. Emotions and deeper feelings. Emotions and deeper feelings may further cloud the introspection finding, may come in the way of scientific and objective assessment of the sensation or the other aspects which you have observed, kind of. So that's a disadvantage. A lot of subjectivity comes in. Then comes the experimental method, which is that last column. We will study some of them. I will want to further take you experimental method. Okay. And now we will study, not necessarily again we will study all of them. It is the observations that take place under the conditions controlled by the experiment. We have as such studied the experimental method earlier. So it's the same. In a controlled manner, experiment is conducted where an investigator or a researcher looks at the behavior of the consumer. The subject is a person on whom the experiment is done. A person who conducts the experimenter either known as an investigator, experimenter, or a researcher, as you say. Variable is any key factor based on which there may be an impact on the selection of a goods or the service. It may change. It may be a qualitative factor. It may be a quantifiable factor. So you keep one factor variable and others you keep constant, and then you try to see the impact of a experiment that has been conducted. So advantage of experimental method is, in the earlier, if I have to give you, we have earlier discussed, you may keep price different at Ghatkopar, at Malabar Hill, at Juhu, etc., and try and see whether price has any relevance, or you may keep the offer different and try and see which offer is working well. So those kind of aspects are studied under the experimental method. Advantage is, since extraneous variables are controlled, there is a greater confidence in the result. Means other extraneous factors are controlled while you are doing an experiment. This thing, you are able to get a better empirical and a scientific understanding. This experimental method under the psychology research, essentially it's a laboratory kind of thing. Earlier experimental method that we have studied was in the open market. So there were many extraneous factors that may also impact, which is very difficult to make out. Here it is done in a laboratory environment. Laboratory environment means not necessarily that you create a lab, etc., but where this experiment is happening, you try to minimize other extraneous factor impacting the experiment. So therefore the belief in this kind of a finding is much higher. Through this method, hypothesis can be tested. You may test your hypothesis that you have set. Cause-effect relation can be tested very well. Repeatability, if all relevant conditions are controlled, the experiment can be replicated by other investigators to verify the result. So advantages, like if there is any doubt coming into your findings, experimental method allows you to repeat the thing, which may not be the case with the open market experiment method. Disadvantage of experimental method is all relevant variables can never be controlled. In reality, you cannot control all relevant variables. So why do the experimental method while you are controlling all those things? Because in reality, it's not going to be like that. Since the experiment is conducted in a lab under controlled condition, the environment is artificial. Subject knows that they are being observed. Subject is very well aware it's an artificial environment. He's under observation. So all his acts are all going to get some conclusive understanding. He may himself get into bias. Okay. Experimental situation may interfere with the result because attitude of the subject can start playing. His attitude also he will start bringing in rather than being independent. So these are the advantages of a lab or an experimental method under psychology research. Investigators' handling may also affect. So person who are investigating, person who are this thing may bring the experiential bias. They have done series of such experiences also in the past. Instead of objectively looking it, they may bring their bias into it, and something that they have observed in the earlier experiment, they may try to apply it here and conclude. The experimental method has limitation as it cannot be used in all situations. You cannot create lab environment for all kind of situations, so it has its own limitations. So what we have understood is that experiential method or under the psychology research, and so motivation research and those things we have studied, the segmentation research. So this is another such area, experimental method. So different types of experimental method exist, which was also listed on that slide. Clinical case study, survey method, developmental method, and method of systematic observation, field study method, or an observation method. Not that we will be covering all of them. We have like overall clinical studies out of this thing. Survey method we have understood. Developmental method again we have studied recently. So it's a different types of experimental method are there to help you study the psychological aspects. So with this, actually we are completing the complete research process, consumer research.